5 Different Interpretations of Colonization. Unit 5 Different Interpretations of Colonizatory Structure 5.0 Introduction 5.1 Unit Objectives 5.2 Perceptions of Colonialism 5.2 1 Bipin Chandra's Economic Colonialism 522 Social and Cultural Colonialism 5.3 Colonial Economy 5.3 1 Debates on Deindustrialization 5.4 Colonial Modernization 5.4 1 Modernity A Timed Idea 5 Peasant Insurgency 5.6 Nationalism Political Nationalism and Cultural Nationalism 5.6 1 Political Nationalism 5.62 Cultural Nationalism 5.7 Summary 5.8 Key Terms 5.9 Answers to check your progress 10 Questions and Exercises 5.11 Further reading 0 Introduction. It is widely accepted by historians and literary scholars that the concept of colonialism brought about both positive and negative impact on the colonies. Various schools of thought such as Marxist, subaltern and postmodernist scholars have come up with their own interpretation of history. Nonetheless, majority of research work has espoused the fact that colonialism inflicted serious political, psychological and economic harms on the people of the colonies. This unit will brief students with various perceptions of colonialism, concept of colonial economics and colonial modernization, instances of peasant insurgency and the concept of political nationalism and cultural nationalism. 5.1 Unit Objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to interpret the various perceptions of colonialism, examine colonial economics and colonial modernization. 1 Cells Relations Tesmal Material. Give examples of instances of peasant insurgency during colonial period. Discuss the concept of political nationalism and cultural nationalism. 5.2 Perceptions of colonialism. Meaning evolved. To put it in a simple way, the earliest perception of colonialism involved economic backwardness. It implied that the British were exploiting India economically. Its wealth was being drained. Industries were being destroyed and resources were being exported. Colonialism meant the systematic exploitation of India's resources by the British over the 200 years of colonial rule. Since the 1970s, we have come across new perceptions on the subject. Colonialism has now been explained in social and cultural terms. The term hegemony became prevalent. Historians began to stress on the aspects as to how the British culturally hegemonized the Indians, through their education policies, through social changes and through the spread of Christianity. Historians did not miss to notice the class hierarchies among Indians. The educated privileged class used the British rule as a tool for their social benefit while the non-privileged classes lagged behind. We will discuss some of the prominent theories on British colonialism in India that help us in understanding the concept. 5.2 1 Bipin Chandra's Economic Colonialism. The economic critique of the British began systematically in the late 19th century with the foundation of the Congress. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 with the inspiration of the British civil servant Alan Octavian Hume and provided a space for discussion to the English-educated elite classes of India. Early leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji severely criticized the British for draining Indian resources and for converting India to a supplier of raw material. Naoroji wrote a book titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India in which he summarized his critique. Before the foundation of the Congress, English-educated elite in various parts of India expressed their visions regarding the British rule. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in his magazine Bangladesh gave a vivid picture of the tenable plight of the peasants of Bengal. The Zamindars of Bengal founded the British Indian Association that worked as a medium of negotiations between the British and the Indians. The Zamindars were vocal about the exploitations of the permanent settlement of 1793 that doomed many landlords of Bengal to destitutes and increased the burden of taxation over the peasants. Even Raja Rammohun Roy raised his voice against the new land revenue system. The early Congress leaders were known as the moderates as they did not prefer to enter into direct conflict with the British. They took the path of negotiations and compromises, often criticized by their successors. But the moderate leaders Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Surendranath Banerjee, Badiruddin Tyabji, Feroz Shah El B0 Rem Nesirik Lechebe, Raisa Ergo So Th4 Mpu Xtaran Sutu, BN and Utarafir and many others triggered the most violent economic critique towards the British. Their adamancy and determination earned them names like Surendravot Banerjee and Ferocious Meter. Mockery on the part of the British did not adhere though. The Governor-General Lord Dufferin called the Congress leaders microscopic minority of Indians, unfit to represent the diverse variety of people belonging to different social strata. Bipin Chandra understood colonialism as a series of economic exploitation on the part of the British. He talked about 3 stages of colonialism, each representing a systematic method to evacuate Indian wealth. First, he quoted the Marxist vision that colonialism was a 2-pronged process, one positive and one negative. The positive stage of colonialism he identified in the first period of the British rule till 1870. Social and educational reforms were the main features of this period, the 2 important processes that connected India to the wider world. The second stage of colonialism was from 1870 to 1914, a period when finance capital entered the colonies and economic exploitation got integrated to the process of governance. Bipin Chandra thinks that both aspects worked simultaneously. The so-called positive aspect was as integral a part of, and contributed effectively to the structuring of colonialism as was the negative aspect. He was critical of Marx for missing out the economic exploitation that was intense before 1870. For Chandra, colonialism was basically economic exploitation or the appropriation of the colony's social surplus. Forms of surplus appropriation or the manner in which the colonial economy and society was to be subordinated and put at the service of the metropolis, underwent changes over time. This systematic economic exploitation through surplus appropriation inspired the colonial policies, state and its institutions, culture, ideas and ideologies. Historically, colonialism underwent 3 distinct stages, each stage representing a different pattern of subordination of colonial economy, society and polity. The change from one stage to another was partially the consequence of the changing patterns of the metropolis, Britain, own social, economic, cultural and political development. The role of England in world economy played a significant role in bringing about the evolution and development of these stages. These stages are not same for all colonial economies of the world, though the basic content could be identified everywhere. Forms of surplus appropriation and other features of colonialism from earlier stages continue into later ones. Each stage was, however, marked by distinct, dominant qualitative features which demarcate it from the other stages. Historical factors and socio-economic situation varied from one colony to another. The first stage, the period of monopoly trade and revenue appropriation. During the first stage, the basic objectives of colonialism were Common monopoly of trade with the colony vis-a-vis other European merchants and the colony's traders. 2. The direct appropriation of revenue or surplus through state different no power. The colonial state waged wars in the colony and on the seas and to maintain naval forces, forts, amics and trading posts. Direct financial profit was one of the basic needs for the colonialists. The element of plunder and direct seizure of surplus was very strong during this stage of colonialism. There was no significant import of metropolitan manufactures into the colony. The second stage. Exploitation through GH tradethis. The essence of the second stage of colonialism was the making of the colour into a subordinate trading partner which would export raw materials and import manufactures. The newly developing industrial and commercial interests in the metropolis and their ideologues began to attack the existing mode of exploitation of the colony with a view to making it serve their interests. They realized that its plundering form is less capable than others of reproducing the conditions for its own reproduction. The industrialist bourgeoisie in the colony wanted new outlets and markets for selling their new manufactured goods. Their intention was to turn the colony to a supplier of raw material. They realized that, the colony could buy more imports only if it increased its exports, which could only be of agricultural and mineral products, to pay for them. 2. The metropolis desired to lessen dependence on non-empire sources of raw materials and foodstuffs. 2. Thirdly, as the subordinated complement of a capitalist economy. The use of the colony both as a market for goods and as a supplier of raw materials must occur with the perspective of extended reproduction. The plantation economies. Tea and coffee plantation and indigo plantation were major features of this stage. The third stage. The era of foreign investments and international competition for colonies with the fast-changing world economy after 1914. A new stage of colonialize could be noticed. Spread of industrialization to several countries of Europe, North America and Japan. The massive application of scientific knowledge to industry and unification of the world market due to a revolution in the means of interracial transport triggered the development of this third stage. A new struggle began to secure the markets and sources of agricultural and mineral raw materials and foodstuffs. Moreover, banking capital merged with industrial capital in several countries. This led to large-scale export of capital and search for monopolized fields and areas where it could be invested. All the three aspects, namely, Marx sources of raw material and capital export, were interlinked. Colonialism at this stage also gave birth to new ideologies like extreme nationalism, chauvinist glorification of the empire and so forth. Even discussions about benevolent despots tended to justify colonialism, politically and administratively. The third stage of colonialism meant renewed and more intensive control over the colony. 5.2. 2. Social and cultural colonialism. Since the 1970s, new ideas began to appear about colonialism that made us look beyond the aspects of economic exploitation. Borrowing the term hegemony from Antonio Gramsci, historians examined the violence colonialism exerted on the minds of the colonized by changing their social system, kinship relations, linguistic orientations, food habits and cultural norms. Ashis Nandi in his famous treatise The Intimate Enemy showed us how colonial rule bifurcated the selves of the Indians. On one hand, they accepted the new, the modern and the alien. On the other hand, they were busy discovering the old, ancient, classical traditions. O.F. Ranajit Guha, the pioneer of the subaltern school, scrutinized the various aspects of the land revenue policies of the British and found deep socio-cultural reasons behind these apparently economic policies. He analyzed the aspects of dominance by the colonial rule that were derived from cultural and philosophical lessons. Dipesh Chakraborty and Partha Chatterjee have shown how the newly educated elite classes of India adopted the British methods of history writing. They freely borrowed the genre of novel and other literary modes from the British. Colonialism, thus, brought about drastic changes in the field of culture. Gauri Viswanathan's intense research on the early education system of British India revealed that the introduction of English literature brought drastic change in the minds of the Indians. It worked well to hegemonize their minds. Thomas Babington Macaulay opined in his famous minute that Indians should be taught English. He wanted a group of Indians who would be Indians in complexion but British in their conduct, culture and ideals, to execute his instructions. The British government introduced the study of English theology and literature. Both religious and secular education deeply inspired a class of Indians, equipped by the new knowledge of philosophy, economics, literature and theology. They attacked the orthodoxy of their own society. A group of young graduates from the Hindu College of Calcutta, known as the Young Bengal, began to critique everything around them. Though they were a small group of young individuals, they stirred the society for decades by their radical thoughts and activities. Colonialism entered deep into the hearts and heads of the colonized. Homi Bhabha, the famous philosopher, had his own theory on colonialism. He opined that the central feature of his theory was that the colonized tried to mimic the colonist, but they never fully succeeded in doing it. They mimicked them to a certain extent and intermingled their traditional cultures to give birth to a new cultural system. Tapan Ray Chaudhuri, Indo-British historian, on the other hand, held that colonial rule worked as a catalyst for the Indians. They learned from it, got inspired by it, but never internalized it fully. They produced a new socio-cultural system by questioning their own traditional orthodoxies. The social reformers debated over the authentic interpretations of the ancient scriptures but never showed India's Tomais the Ang Nai or the Sun the Its Y Nai in 5.2. 2. Social and cultural colonialism. Since the 1970s, new ideas began to appear about colonialism that made us look beyond the aspects of economic exploitation. Borrowing the term hegemony from Antonio Gramsci, historians examined the violence colonialism exerted on the minds of the colonized by changing their social system, kinship relations, linguistic orientations, food habits and cultural norms. Ashis Nandi in his famous treatise The Intimate Enemy showed us how colonial rule bifurcated the selves of the Indians. On one hand, they accepted the new, the modern and the alien. On the other hand, they were busy discovering the old, ancient, classical traditions. O.F. Ranajit Guha, the pioneer of the subaltern school, scrutinized the various aspects of the land revenue policies of the British and found deep socio-cultural reasons behind these apparently economic policies. He analyzed the aspects of dominance by the colonial rule that were derived from cultural and philosophical lessons. Dipesh Chakraborty and Partha Chatterjee have shown how the newly educated elite classes of India adopted the British methods of history writing. They freely borrowed the genre of novel and other literary modes from the British colonialism, thus, brought about drastic changes in the field of culture. Gauri Viswanathan's intense research on the early education system of British India revealed that the introduction of English literature brought drastic change in the minds of the Indians. It worked well to hegemonize their minds. Thomas Babington Macaulay opined in his famous minute that Indians should be taught English. He wanted a group of Indians who would be Indians in complexion but British in their conduct, culture and ideals, to execute his instructions. The British government introduced the study of English theology and literature. Both religious and secular education deeply inspired a class of Indians, equipped by the new knowledge of philosophy, economics, literature and theology. They attacked the orthodoxy of their own society. A group of young graduates from the Hindu College of Calcutta, known as the Young Bengal, began to critique everything around them. Though they were a small group of young individuals, they stirred the society for decades by their radical thoughts and activities. Colonialism entered deep into the hearts and heads of the colonized. Homi Bhabha, the famous philosopher, had his own theory on colonialism. He opined that the central feature of his theory was that the colonized tried to mimic the colonist, but they never fully succeeded in doing it. They mimicked them to a certain extent and intermingled their traditional cultures to give birth to a new cultural system. Tapan Ray Chaudhuri, Indo-British historian, on the other hand, held that colonial rule worked as a catalyst for the Indians. They learned from it, got inspired by it, but never internalized it fully. They produced a new socio-cultural system by questioning their own traditional orthodoxies. The social reformers debated over the authentic interpretations of the ancient scriptures but never showed India's Ch0d reputations oats any interest to directly borrow from British theology. In the last 2 decades, numerous works have been written on the different perspectives of colonialism. Rajat Kanta Ray, a historian of South Asian history, has shown how Colonialny Cambridge School relationship as the Marxist school of historians stressed the economic aspects of colonialism. The group known as the Cambridge School focused on local politics and interests of individuals. They saw colonialism from the viewpoint of selfish interests of leaders. They held that the Indian leaders were in no way self-sacrificial. The overarching categories of the exploiting British and the exploited Indians were rejected by them. They showed that local interests of leaders drove them to fall out with their fellow countrymen. Nationalist struggle was actually a conglomerate of interest gathering of various groups and classes. People of India were already divided on the basis of class, caste and religion. The ideals of nationalism patriotism could not unify them. They defined these ideologies in their own way. The British used these divisions to apply the divide and rule policy that ultimately led to the partition of India. The Cambridge School historians deny the existence of a specific ideology in the nationalist school. They rather opine that the cell common feature that bound the nationalist leaders together was that all of them intended to safeguard the interests of their own respective communities. The Subaltern School, the group of historians known as the Subaltern School, who appeared in the early 1980s, viewed colonialism from the aspect of marginality. They attracted attention by stating that the history of India so far had been written from the viewpoint of the elites, the worldview of the peasant, the tribal and other marginal groups like women. Workers were absent from this narrative. They began extensive usage of vernacular and folk material so far neglected. New meanings of colonial rule began to emerge. Ranajit Guha opened our eyes to the new meanings of peasant insurgency. He showed us how the peasants, deeply embedded in their traditional pattern of folk life, negotiated with colonial rule and invented their own language to resist exploitation. The caste class hierarchy is one of the central tools of his analysis. Dipesh Chakrabarti applied the same method to write on the workers' movements. Gautam Badra, Shahid Amin, Gayatri Chakrabarti, Spivak Six Prakash and other prominent subaltern historians made us aware of each aspect of marginality and showed how the so-called marginal groups dealt with colonial. Check your Progress 1. Name the moderate leaders of the Indian National Congress. 2. State the 3 distinct stages of colonialism. 5.3 Colonial economy. Economic system. There are diverse views on the nature of colonial economy. As has been discussed before, till the 1970s colonialism was understood as and have studied in the last section about Bipin Chandra's analysis of the 3 stages of colonialism. Here we will focus on certain visions that often contradict with each other. The main question about colonial economy was whether the British rule exploited India or not. What was the degree of exploitation? Did all classes get affected by the constant appropriation of agricultural surplus from India? What was the role of the Indian elites? Did they get benefits of the colonial rule? Did colonial rule integrate India to a wider world economy that emerged in the beginning of the 20th century? Till the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, India served as a major market for British industries, like cotton, iron and steel, railways, machinery and other items. At the time of the First World War, Indians consumed 85% of cotton piece goods produced at Lancashire and 17% of British iron and steel production was absorbed by the Indian railways. India was also a field for British capital investments in railways and the agency houses. R.P. India Today, one of the major Marxist interventions of colonial economy, raised some criticisms of the ideas of Marx on the British colony in India. The 3 stages defined by Bipin Chandra, inspired by Marx, were criticised by Dutt. He held that the periodization, 1757 to 1813, 1813 to 1858, 1858 to 1947, was somewhat arbitrary and overlapping. 5.3. 1. Debates on deindustrialization. As we have already discussed the 3 stages in detail above and saw that the central point of analysis was how the British exploited India over the passage of time. In this section we will focus on a different aspect. Since the 1980s, a group of historians began to question whether India was ever so intensely exploited or not. The common idea that the British rule caused decline and deindustrialization in India has led to serious critiques. The supporters of the theory of deindustrialization have shown how the traditional industries and handicrafts declined sharply since the beginning of the 19th century as India was gradually tuned into the supplier of raw material. Indians' markets were dumped with cloths from Manchester and Lancashire. The Industrial Revolution in Europe brought utter misfortune to Indians. Britain's process of modernization took heavy toll on India. The suffering caused by the decline of handicrafts was counterbalanced fairly soon by the much greater employment and income-generating effect of setting up factories and industries. The US scholar Morris D. Morris argued that deindustrialization itself was a myth. Tirthankar Roy too is a champion of this thesis. Precise statistical details on the decline of the handicrafts were difficult to the indicator of decline in the proportion of population dependent on industries. Nationalists relied heavily on statistics of external trade indicating a collapse in traditional Indian textile exports and a rapid increase in Lancashire imports. But these did not constitute a definite proof of decline in aggregate interior productio, and urban luxury manufactures were adversely affected by the colonial drain of wheat, but village crafts in the interior, and particularly in regions other than Castor Hills where British penetration was earliest and deepest, probably survived much longer. The presence of the Jajmani or village exchange system too was a proof of the survival of traditional rural industries like carpentry, pottery, weaving and authors. Morris' thesis had its own problems. He did not provide proper data to support his thesis. Toru Matsui added his rejoinder to develop Morris' thesis. He showed that though the Indian weavers gained from the use of cheaper imported yam, there was no decline in weaving costs, and yet they had to compete with the lower prices of imported cloth. The theory of deindustrialization was drawn on a bulk of scattered data appearing in a range of sources like the census, the famine reports and regional industrial surveys. Surveys of Bengal manufactures by Colin in 1890 and Cummings in 1908 might be cited here. The latter made the point that the Swadeshi movement of 1905 to 1911 saved many industries from being extinct. Amiai Bagchi's careful examination of some of the Bihar districts in the early 19th century showed that there was a decline in the percentage of population dependent on industries from 18% to 8%, and a massive fall in the number of cotton spinners and weavers. The nationalist assertion that there was deindustrialization was not so wrong. The support for the theories of drain of wealth, deindustrialization and other aspects stimulated patriotic sentiments among intellectuals alike in the moderate, extremist and Gandhian eras. Foreign investments. The introduction of railways marked a new era in the history of colonial economy in India. Along with railways, the massive expansion in road transport, irrigation, sanitary system and various other infrastructural facilities almost brought a revolution in the socio-economic, even cultural life of India. The huge expenses incurred by these projects were categorized under the Home Charges or paying for the Secretary of State and his establishment at the India Office in London. The actual transfer of money took place through the sale of council bills, which were sold in London in sterling to purchasers of Indian goods who received Indian rupees in exchange. The authority in England often opined that the rhetoric of drainage was an exaggeration, but historians calculated the amount of drainage at 17 million British pounds per annum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They pointed out that this represented less than 2% of the value of India's exports or commodities in that period. Railways played a significant role during the British rule towards the development of modern economic infrastructure. But the history of railway construction in India reveals that the main purpose behind it was to secure the interests of the colonizers. In 1853, Lord Dalhousie took the decision to construct railways in India mainly to facilitate army movements, to connect the port cities to the internal markets and sources of raw materials. The railway companies were given free land with 99 years lease, after the expiry of which the line would become government property. The government guaranteed them 5% interest to be paid, so they could enjoy 5% guaranteed profit for 98 years and then get back all their capital. This made the railway projects, as Sabayasachi Bhattacharya described them, an instance of P-rivet enterprise at the railways. Though it linked various parts of India and facilitated the nationalist leaders to connect with each other, ultimately appeared to be a curse for the poor Indians. The elevation of railway lines caused repeated floods. The environmental balance was challenged by the forceful expansion of railways through marshy, swampy and riverine landscape of eastern India. The wealth of rural India was exported fast through the feeder roads to the railways. Famine became a common phenomenon in all parts of the country. When the British left, in 1946-47 there was 217 kilometers of railway tracks in India, covering 78% of the total area. Commercialization of agriculture. It can be argued that between 1900 and 1939, the area under irrigation almost doubled, but by that time India suffered from severe famines, floods and series of epidemics. Commercialization of agriculture added to this exploitation. In Marxist view, it was a sign of progress towards capitalist agriculture. In the Indian case, however, the initiative often did not come from within the peasant society and the benefits also did not accrue to them. In the case of indigo in eastern India, in 1788 the East India Company offered advances to 10 pioneer planters trying to grow indigo in Lower Bengal. Until 1829 the planters did not have the right to buy oil and so they had to persuade and later force the local peasants to accept advances to produce indigo in their lands. Their exploitative and coercive measures led to the Indigo Rebellion of 1859 to 1860 public risk. Everywhere in India the peasants were forced to cultivate cash crops because of high revenue demand. The necessity to pay revenue and rent in cash and above all for debt servicing. Only the rich peasants could go for cash crops and they too remained immensely vulnerable to the fluctuations in the market. In western India, cotton cultivation grew in response to the cotton boom in the 1860s caused by the American Civil War. After creating initial prosperity, it soon declined after the end of the war and was followed by famine and agrarian riots in the No. 5 1870s. Jute cultivation in eastern India increased as the peasants hoped to pay back their loans from the profit. Jute cultivation was so lucrative at a time that it even gained the name golden crop. But Sugata Bose has shown that the primary producers could hardly reap the benefit of the boom in jute market between 19s were able to exercise their monopsony power as purchasers of raw jute. Levingen 1913, as the jute manufacturers and exporters, majority of whom were British, the jute growers no space to bargain for prices. Tirthankar Roy, a champion of the counter-nationalist view, has argued that it is possible that the capitalists captured most or all of the increase in value added. The rich may have become richer, but that does not mean that the poor got poorer. 4. Total income had increased, but most historians rejected his hypothesis. The peasants were no way in a happy state. Commercialization of agriculture did not benefit the majority of the peasants. It can neither be argued that it helped the transition from pre-capitalist to capitalist mode of production. The jute economy crashed in the 1930s and was followed by a devastating famine in Bengal in 1943. The aggregate production of food crops lagged behind population growth. Indian investments. A discussion on colonial economy would remain incomplete without a section on the role played by the Indian entrepreneurs. Historians like Rajat Kantarayan and Yang enriched the study of colonial economy by examining the role of the bazaar. A little distracted translation of the term market. By bazaar, they meant the vast Indian economic system that is often set aside as the unorganized sector but in reality played a crucial role in controlling and establishing the basis of colonial economy. Ray's study expanded beyond India. He pointed out the important role played by Asian bazaar which was controlled by the indigenous traders. Foreign capital was intensely dependent upon the assistance of the Indian merchants. The whims of the exchange notes, hundis and various regulations of the bazaar often unsettled the stability of foreign capital. Ray and Yang identified the location of the bazaar between the rural agricultural sector and the foreign capital that was imported from Europe. The vast world of the bazaar determined the movement of money in both sectors. The traditional Indian investors did not miss the opportunity to enter competition with foreign capital. They often donated in bulks for the cause of the nationalist movement, and there it made a difference. Since the 1920s, some Calcutta-based Marwaris, who had experiences as traders and shroffs, began to invest in jute industry. By helping the British in their business, many of the Marwans got themselves elected to the boards of the European managing agencies. Famous industrialists like G.D. Birla and Swarup and Hukumshan set up their own mills in 1922. By 1930s, this group of Indian entrepreneurs elevated themselves to the position to challenge the hegemony of foreign capital. The Marwari stronghold was gradually extended to other sectors like coal mines, sugar mills and papar between 1942 and 1945. We can see that these big businessmen were taking over some of the European companies. By the 1950s, argues Omkar Goswami, they were poised to take over almost all the older industries in the region which had hitherto been dominated by European capital. B.R. Tomlinson thought this trend was integral to the process of decolonization, but Goswami gave more credits to the Marwari businessmen. The most intense success the Indian entrepreneurs gained was in the cotton industry of Western India. The Swadeshi movement added a new chapter to this phase. Traditional Indian trading communities like the Gujarati Banias, Parsis, Boris and Vaishyas maintained a continual hegemony in this sector. It had its early beginning in Bombay in the 1870s and 1880s. Then its diversification beyond Bombay in the 1890s, first to Ahmedabad, and then to other centres like Sholapur or Kanpur. Its major expansion came after the First World War and in the 1920s. Though it expanded further in the 1930s, the use of technology was still poor. Check your progress 3. Mention the significant changes introduced by the British which brought about transformation in the social and cultural life of the Indians. 4. What was the Indigo Rebellion of 1859 to 1860? Industry 5. For colonial modernization, the question of modernity is one of the central themes in the studies on colonialism. Scholars have debated a lot on the definition and nature of modernity in economic, social and cultural spheres. The idea of modernity is integral to the subject of Western dominance, the periodization of time into ancient, medieval and modern Western contribution to world history. The ancient period is generally identified as the classical age, the medieval the dark age and the modern the age of individualism and civil rights. The features of modernity are defined by Western standards, especially in the former colonies. Here, we will discuss the arguments of the Marxist, subaltern and postmodernist historians on the arrival of modernity in India. In the discussions on modernity, the central question is its temporality. When did modernity arrive in a certain region or among a certain community? Or did it arrive at all? Who sets the standards of a modern civilization? In colonial history, we always notice that the standards are fixed by the colonial rulers. The colonized people are seen as backward, primitive and lagging behind on the timeline of du Prelost's civilization. Johannes Fabian, the famous philosopher, questioned this idea of linear timeline. He looked at this imposition of standards as a Western arrogance, by Western standards of modernity. Modernity itself appears to be a void and communities have its own features of progress. It is impossible to judge a culture 19th century. Simultaneously with the emergence of the English-educated middle class 5, 4, 1 modernity. A timed idea. The British utilitarians and evangelicals in the late 18th and early 19th century set some standards for modernity. They unanimously held that India w backward and it was the duty of the colonial masters to civilize the Indians. The British scheme is best reflected in the poetry of Rudyard Kipling where he defined this duty as the white man's burden. Drawing from extremely racist discourses it set the white man as superior to the natives. In contemporary white fiction, Kipling, E. M. Forster, John Masters, Meadows Taylor, we find representation of this mentality. It was the job of the British to spread modern education among the Indians who were otherwise seen as backward, lacking history and culture. The European Orientalist scholars, however, had a totally different vision of India. Max Muller, William Jones and William Carey were busy collecting ancient Sanskrit scriptures from various parts of India. They discovered an unknown India in these scriptures. They classified the ancient civilization of India as a classical one, upholding ancient India and Hinduism as an ideal age. They opined that the British advent revived India from an intervening era of darkness. Both the utilitarians and the Orientalist scholars praised the British rule for bringing socio-cultural changes in India that helped the country in stepping forward towards a modern era. The historians of the Indian awakening or Renaissance of the 19th century presented various arguments on the arrival of modernity in India. In the 1940s and 1950s the general notion was that the cultural awakening liberated India from the Dark Age and medieval orthodoxies. They argue that in the Mughal era the social, political and economic life of India reached a standstill. The British brought new waves of reform and progress. Among contemporary scholars, we can name E. Alexander Duff, the missionary who wrote in 1840 that Bengal was witnessing the dawn of an auspicious era. Kishorachand Mitra, civil servant and social worker, referred to a new resurrection in Bengal life in 1861. They began to mark the age as the era of unnati, improvement, the age of new education and perspectives and hence, modernism. The regional languages like Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, Oriya, Tamil, Assamese appeared in new robe. The idea of awakening was not confined only to social reform. The idea of new was central to the theme of the Renaissance. Idioms like improvement, awakening, resurrection, enlightenment, dawn were commonly used to define the age. Terms like Nava, Navaya, Newton, all meaning new, were massively used in the public discourse. Among religious movements we find Navavidhan, among journals Navajivan, Navaya Bharat and so forth. We notice a radical break from this view since the 1970s. David Kopf in his 1969 monograph British Orientalism and the Bengal Renaissance questioned whether the term Renaissance was fit for describing a particular cultural pattern or historical change. Sumit Sarkar, an Indian historian of modern India, in 1975 raised some basic questions on the Renaissance. He noticed that the older studies on the Renaissance centered around certain famous characters and their achievements. It missed the changes that affected the lower classes of society. The Marxist historians were skeptical about the arrival of modernity in this period. They used Marxist tools to explain this idea. Marx's model holds that the advent of modernity is synonymous with the coming of capitalist mode of production. The transition from feudalism to capitalism marks the shift to modernity in all societies. Marxist historians argued that Indian economy was still not mature enough to welcome capitalism. Hence, the scheme of modernity was postponed too. They rejected the idea that Indian Renaissance was an expression of progress and advancement. Ashok Sen in his 1977 study on Vidyasagar called him a bona fide individual trapped in a stage of nullified modernization, while retaining immense respect for Vidyasagar. He complained that the Bengali intelligentsia had imbibed Western ideals of humanism, individualism and political thoughts, but reformers like Vidyasagar failed to see that the economy and society of Bengal did not live up to the necessary conditions for capitalist development. Berendi questioned the analogy with the European Renaissance and also denied the advent of bourgeois modernity in Bengal. He opined that colonial despotism prevented the arrival of such modernity. The subaltern study collectively enriched this criticism. Ranajit Guha, Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakrabarti and Sudipto Kaviraj chronicled the failure of the Renaissance. Through his analysis of Bankim Chandra's writings, Kaviraj showed how the era forged an unhappy consciousness of colonialism. Ranajit Guha criticized the Renaissance for being elitist and for feeding on the messianic tendency of nationalist discourse. It ignored the voice of the popular masses. The scholars of this paradigm pointed out the paradoxes in the characters of the social reformers. Ram Mohan was attentive to caste rules. Keshab Chandra married his daughter at an early age, and Vidyasagar argued against the age of consent bill. The champions of modernity themselves were subject to various orthodoxies, prejudices and evil practices. Nationalism and modernity. The nationalist movement combined the cultural ideas of modernity with the ongoing political struggle. The nationalist leaders understood that attaining nationhood and self-governance was the only way to be modern. The great intellectual question that the 19th century intelligentsia had posed to itself was, why did India already mastery over this huge landmass? The reason cited was the internal disunity of the Indians at the time of the British advent. So, national unity, communal harmony and integration were upheld as basic conditions for attaining modernity. The nationalist leaders consciously sought for a different kind of modernity for India. To distinguish her from Britain and other European nations, India needed her own version of modernity. Leaders, philosophers, historians, artists and sensitive people from all walks of life sought for a definition of Indian modernity. In general, educated Indians saw themselves as hybrid productions of an Anglo-Indian culture. In his essay on the census and objectification, Bernard Cohn cited from a 1943 text by Jawaharlal Nehru where Nehru observed, "I have become a queer mixture of the East and the West, out of place everywhere, at home nowhere. They are both, i.e., the East and the West, part of me, and though they help me in both the East and the West, but they also create a feeling of spiritual loneliness. 1 am a stranger and an alien in the West. But in my own country also, sometimes, I have an exile's feeling." The challenge for the Indians was to curve out a definition of modernity from these contradictions. Both men and women had to prepare themselves in a way so that they can represent an alternative modernity which would be fundamentally different from that of Britain. Partha Chatterjee, in his famous essay The Nationalist Resolution of the Women's Question, has shown that the Indian nationalists bifurcated their world into the public and the private. The 19th century reforms to improve the condition of women were possible with the help of the British administrators. In the beginning of the 20th century, Indian men denied access to the Britishers to their private spaces. Women of the household embodied the private space. This is the reason that no social reform was encouraged in the late colonial period. Rather, women prepared themselves to make appearance in the public. The image of the Bhadra Mahila or lady had to be constructed. The modern lady had to distinguish herself from the British Memzahids and also from the lower-class labouring women. The middle-class women, thus, became the symbol and epitome of modernity. She was different from men and from other classes of women. The idea of modernity rested on her image. Gandhian critique of modernity. M.K. Gandhi perhaps launched the starkest critique of modernity. In his treatise Hind Swaraj, bluntly challenged the tools of modern economy. He attacked their scheme of railways and the figures of the modem doctor and the lawyer. He held the view that these three tools of modem economy were winning India. The railways were draining the wealth and converting India to a supplier of raw materials. Modem doctors, trained in colonial medical colleges, shifted from natural medicine. Their relationship with their patients was artificial. The natural and herbal drugs of earlier rhymes were silently making an exit from medical knowledge, and the lawyers were directly looting their clients. The British legal system complicated the process of judgment. It completely departed from the system of personal law. The legal profession turned out to be a lucrative one. Rather than supporting helpless, often indebted peasants, people seeking for justice, the lawyers looked at their clients as sources of big money. Gandhi's harsh critique of modernity impressed people all over the world. Leaders fighting racism like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela acknowledged his ideas. Ashis Nandi once called him the first postmodernist critique of modernity. Though Gandhian philosophy was not followed in independent India, Gandhi drew huge respects from people of all walks of life. Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore and many other leaders of the nationalist movement saw the revival of village India as a sign of modernity. Tagore at Visvabharati University, which he established in Birmingham district of Bengal in 1902, accomplished some of the schemes of modern economy he had in his mind. He founded the Sri Niketan Cooperative in 1925 where weaving, carpentry and different sorts of crafts were taught. They thought the way towards modernity was to reform the village first. And this was probably the dream of all the proponents of Indian modernity, that the modern nation should not arise from the machines of the Industrial Revolution. It should rather be integral to village India, be close to the nature and soil. Check your progress. 5. What was the viewpoint of European Orientalist scholars with referencito modernity in India? 6. What was the objective of setting up Sri Niketan Cooperative by Tagore? 5. Peasant insurgency. Peasant protests against excessive amount of taxation and various other impositions of the colonial rule were common since the beginning of the British era. But the most intense peasant movements can be traced back to the 1850s in various parts of India, such as at the eve of the revolt of 1857. The elites and middle-class Indians were busy doing social reforms with the help of the British. But the peasants in the rural parts of the country responded to the colonial rule in a quite different manner. Historians in the last few decades have examined the peasant movements from different perspectives. Earlier peasant and tribal uprisings were written from the perspectives of the elite. Now a new group of historians, the subaltern school most prominent among them, initiated new thoughts and insights. Ranajit Guha, the pioneer of the subaltern school, demanded that the histories of peasant insurgencies should be written from the viewpoint of the peasants. The historians should first understand the point of view of the peasants. The use of vernacular and folk material became essential. A new genre called the history from below emerged since the 1980s. Peasant revolts were not unknown in Mughal India, but by the middle of and changes brought by the colonial rule. Daniel Tamir and D.N. Danaga, the 19th century. Peasant protests intensified due to the constant impositions. Analyze the nature of these changes. They have shown how the rural society was divided on the basis of class and caste hierarchies. The absentee landlords and rich peasants exploited the poor tenants and landless riots. 65 to 70% of the agricultural population was non-owners of land. The situation worsened after the revolt of 1857. David Hardiman, historian of modern India, categorized their power as landlords. 2. Peasants or peasant farmers, and 3. The poor rural population as follows. 1. The rural magnates, who were gradually building on peasants. The revenue policies of the government and the colonial administrative and judicial systems worked as effective machineries to impoverish the peasant. As colonial peasant uprisings can be traced back To the 1770s, the revolt of Raja Chait Singh and other Zamindars of Awadh in 1778 to 1781. The peasant revolt in the Tirunelveli district of North Arcot and the ceded districts of Andhra between 1799 and 1805. The revolt of Pazhassi Raja which rocked Malabar in 1796-1805. And the Rangpa rebellion of 1783 in the northern districts of Bengal, some of the examples of peasant uprisings in the colonial period. But the first most militant and widespread peasant movement was the Indigo Revolt of 1859 to 1860. I was the outcome of the extreme oppression of the indigo planters in the rural areas of Bengal. Facing violent attacks from the armed peasants, the planters began to close their factories and the cultivation of indigo was virtually wiped out from the districts of Bengal by the end of 1860. Another major agrarian outbreak occurred in the Pune and Ahmednagar districts of Maharashtra in 1875, which is commonly known as the famous Deccan Riot. Here the targets of the peasants were the Moneelanders, who mostly hailed from the Marwari and Gujarati communities, though the Ryotwari system confirmed direct agreement with the peasants. The oppressive Moneelanders appeared as middlemen between the British administrators and the agricultural population. Passive resistance and social boycott were two most significant modes of this revolt that left long-term impact on the nationalist movements. The colonial rulers were alarmed by the violent outbreak of revolt and ultimately assured them certain protection against the Moneelanders. THRR the Deccan Agriculturists REL-IEF at 1879. The peasants also got support from the English-educated middle class. The Pune Sarbajanik Sabha led by Justice Renade stood by the side of the peasants. The Mapula outbreak in the Malabar, a century-long protest from 1836-10-1921. The Ramosi peasant revolt in Maharashtra led by Vasudev Balwant Fade 15ED1 TSCT 60 in 1879. The Kukar revolt in the Punjab led by Baba Ram Singh in 1872 and the series of peasant riots in Assam during 1893 to 1894 are some instances of peasant uprisings that took place in the 19th century. Eric Stokes, Radrangshu Mukherjee and other historians saw the revolt of 1857 as a peasant revolt as the soldiers, the peasants in uniform. The Great Revolt was an ultimate outcome of the tyrannical revenue policies of the British. It was the first major protest against the aggressive imperial strategies, for instance, doctrine of lapse, of Lord Dalhousie, majorly appointed from the agrarian population. Stokes called the soldiers were peasant. Discontent in the 20th century was very much mingled with the anti-colonial nationalist movement. The nationalist leaders often tried to include the rural protests within the fold of the Congress movements. Still, the peasant protests successfully maintained some distinctive features. The Congress inspired the setting up of the Kisan Sabhas in various parts of rural India. The UP Kisan Sabha was set up in February 1918 through the efforts of Gauri Shankar Misra and Indra Narain Dwivedi, and with the support of Madan Mohan Malaviya. Baidevi Sabhas organised regular meetings of the peasants and set up agendas for future. Babaram Chandra, a Brahmin from Maharashtra and a wanderer who worked as an indentured labourer in Fiji, emerged as the leader of the peasants of Awadh in the middle of the 1920s. He led the peasants to continue with peaceful protests. The peasants filed thousands of complaints regarding Badakli and Nasvanaram Chandra, with 32 Kishans got arrested, giving way to widespread discontent. Peasant protests spread fast in other parts of the United Provinces like Raebareli, Fizabad, Sultanpur and others. The government got compelled to pass the Ard-Rand Amendment, act that brought little relief to the peasants. M.K. Gandhi gave a new prominence to the peasant movements by incorporating them within the folds of the non-violent non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 1922 and also in the civil disobedience movement of 1932. He successfully applied his method of satyagraha at Champaran, Kheda Badali and other places. Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, Maulana Azad, Subhash Chandra Bose among other famous Congress leaders joined Gandhi to reach his goal. The formation of the Congress Socialist Party in 1934 gave new life to the peasant struggles. The Communist Party took deep interest in mobilizing the peasants. N.G. Ranga and other Kishan leaders worked hard to consolidate the peasants and to coordinate the movements in various parts of India. Swami Sahajanand, the militant founder of the Bihar Provincial Kishan Sabha, 1929, was elected the president, and N.G. Ranga the general secretary. Peasant movements continued till the end of the British rule. Regular communication between the protesting peasants and the nationalist leaders was a principal feature of the peasant movements. The most important contribution of the peasant movements that covered large areas of the subcontinent in the 1930s and 1940s was that they created the not abolition just after the end of the colonial rule was a direct outcome of these necessary atmosphere for the post-independence agrarian reforms. Zamindari with a reduction of taxes, abolition of illegal cesses or feudal levies and beggar movements. The major issues of peasant protest in the pre-independence period or Vethi, the ending of oppression by landlords and their agents, the reduction of debts, the restoration of illegally or illegitimately seized lands, and security often for tenants. The movements in post-independence India often got mingled with the tribal and environmentalist movements. Representatives of peasants joined parliamentary politics and placed their demands forward. Workers' movements. The peasant movements were in many cases integral to the workers' movement, especially the communist leaders brought them under the same umbrella. The modern working class emerged in India only in the latter half of the 19th century with the mass expansion of the industrial projects. With the setting up or class of industrial labour class arose, the Indian National Congress attached itself railways and factories, with increasing practices of mining and plantation. As heir to the working class movements by the end of the 1890s, before that the workers already organised themselves at several factory locations, mainly textile mills, railways and plantations. In Bombay, Calcutta, Ahmedabad, Surat, Madras, Coimbatore, Wadhar and various other places, they were mostly sporadic, spontaneous and unorganised revolts without any wider political agenda. The early nationalist leaders made some attempts to represent the workers and were vocal about the inhuman situation at their workplaces. Saurabji Shapoorji Bengal in 1878 tried unsuccessfully to introduce a bill in the Bombay Legislative Council to limit the working hours for labourers. Some efforts were also taken to educate the workers. Night schools were set up in various cities of India including Bombay and Calcutta. Sasipada Banerjee, a Brahmo social reformer, brought out a monthly journal called Bharat's Ramajibi, Indian Labour, in Bombay. Narayan Meghaj Lokhande brought out an Anglo-Marathi weekly magazine called Dinabandhu, Friend of the Poor, in 1880, and founded the Bombay Mill and Millhands Association in 1890. All these leaders mobilized the workers with their individual efforts. The participation of the nationalist leaders in the labour movements began much later. The most important development in the working class history in colonial India was the formation of the All India Trade Union Congress, ATUC, in 1920. Lokmanya Tilak and Lala Lajpat Rai were the prominent leaders with Dewan Charman Lal as its first president. The manifesto issued to the workers by the ATUC urged them not only to demand for themselves but also to participate in the nationalist movement. Workers of India, your nation's leaders ask for Swaraj, you must not let them leave you out of the reckoning. Political freedom to you is of no worth without economic freedom. You cannot therefore afford to ensue 19 WPP neglect the movement for national freedom. Lajpat Rai linked capitalism to imperialism and blamed colonial rule for the poor condition of the labourers. Chittaranjan Das proposed joint movements by peasants and labourers and suggested them to put forward their demands together. Gandhian movements got unprecedented response from the workers. In 1918, Gandhi founded the Ahmedabad Textile Labour Association, TLA, and communicated his principle of trusteeship, the capitalist being the trustee of the workers' interest, through it. Since the late 1920s, the left groups entered the politics of trade union and organised the workers. They established the Workers' and Peasants' Parties, WPP, in various places of India under the leadership of people like S.A. Dange, Muzaffar Ahmad, P.C. Joshi and Sohan Singh Josh. In the ATUC too, by the time of the 1928 Jeria session, the left leaders, including the communists, acquired a dominating position. The workers under the communist and radical nationalist influence participated in a large number in the strikes and demonstrations all over the country between 1927 and 1929. The ATUC also participated in the demonstration against the infamous Simon Commission of 1927. The unity of the workers and peasants was probably the most important event of labour movement on the eve of independence. Check your progress 7. Name the first most prominent peasant movement during the colonial period 8. What was the famous Deccan Riot 9. Mention some of the significant peasant uprisings that took place in the 19th century 5.6 Nationalism. Political nationalism and cultural nationalism. The idea of nationalism is one of the most discussed and debated topics in history everywhere around the world. The idea has been categorized in various ways. The term nationalism comes from nation, a term most variously defined under varying contexts. What is a nation? How did the nation come into being? A simple answer that the term nation connotes a common feeling of a group of people that they share an identical past. People belonging to the same nation enjoy some socio-cultural similarities. Benedict Anderson in his famous treatise Imagined Communities has defined the nation as a community imagined by a group of people. Nationalism is a feeling, a realization of commonness and unity. Anderson has shown that the emergence of nationalist sentiments in Europe was simultaneous to the arrival of print culture and the newspaper. It was the morning newspaper that made people conscious about the nooks and comers of the territory they imagined as their nation. Parallel rise of the vernacular languages further unite. D. Anderson's thesis is one of the most popular theories on nationalism. Indian scholars too were influenced by his thesis. The emergence of nationalism in India had some similar characteristics. The arrival of print culture and newspapers helped informing public opinion. Both English and vernacular newspapers circulated widely, so it is evident that political nationalism has the elements of cultural nationalism at its base. Till the 1960s and early 1970s, scholars of Indian history focused more on political history and the nuances of nationalist sentiments in the political sphere. Since the late 1970s, they concentrated more on the cultural and social background of nationalism. Even Gandhian movement, one of the most important expressions, C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sarkar, A.R. Desai followed by Bipin Chand formed the theories of political nationalism over decades. They were subsequently basis of the nationalist ideal. The Marxists refused to accept the idealistic base of nationalism. They complained that the nationalist struggle could launch India to an era of lopsided development and dilapidated modernity. Anil Seal, one of the earliest Cambridge School scholars, along with his colleagues John Gallagher and Gordon Johnson, argued that the leaders of the freedom struggle were subject to their narrow personal interests. They never fought for a wider cause. It was the subaltern school and the subsequent scholars who explained the idea of cultural nationalism. Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Sudipto Kaviraj, Shahid Amin and Homi Babhar are some of the scholars who contributed in this field. 5.6. 1. Political nationalism. The central argument of the nationalist leaders of colonial India was that Indian nation began to be formed in the late 19th century. Prior to that, there was no existence of the political nation. Surendranath Banerjee, one of the architects of the modern Indian nation, titled his memoir A Nation in Making. Partha Chatterjee argued that the nationalist feeling was confined to the educated elite. They borrowed the idea from the West, and so he called it a derivative discourse. Ashis Nandi too founded Indian nationalism, a response to Western imperialism. He showed that the alternative version of universalism was rooted in Indian civilization and propounded by men like Rabindranath Tagore or Mahatma Gandhi. The counter-modernist critic, S., of the imperial West, was rejected by the Western educated middle class. The Indian nationalists accepted the Western model of nation star as the defining principle of their nationalism. There are, however, theories that looked for a presence of national sentiments in the pre-modern era. C. A. Bailey, one of the finest scholars in Till Field, argued that Indian nationalism was built on pre-existing sense of territorial people on linguistic terms of political nationalism, based itself on socio-cultural reforms, and traditional patriotism evident in the indigenous ethical governments. But he too acted the fact that connecting various parts of India by a common nationalis differ was a phenomenon of the British era. Early nationalist scholars identified a common antipathy towards colonial rule that united people of India, though they were often distanced by regional and local interests. A feeling of patriotism and an ideology rooted in a sense of pride in India's ancient traditions were added to tea as they missed the fact that Indian society was already divided into various Castell communities, religious groups. Class difference cut across all these divisions, Indian social divisions, and created a new status group, the Western educated diet, which drew its members from the existing privileged indigenous collectives, such as the Bhadralok in Bengal, the Chitpavan Brahmins in Bombay and the Tamil Brahmins of Madras. The backward regions or the underprivileged groups that remained outside this limited political nation had no access to the modern institutional life of colonial India. Though there were several protracted caste movements and group mobilities in various parts of India, it was M.K. Gandhi who first took long-term steps to mobilize these groups and integrated them with the countrywide nationalist movement. The group of historians that was known earlier as the Cambridge School has been called by Rajat Ray the neo-traditionalist group. They studied Indian history within the confines of locality and province. They argued that British imperialism was not strong enough to penetrate to remote parts of India. The Indian collaborators, therefore, took the advantage. They drew allegiance from the local population and thus formed fragmentary versions of nationalism that often did not fit into the wider picture of nationalist politics. This led to the emergence of various interest groups, which started to expand their constituencies as the British introduced local self-government and electoral system. The national movement was led by these self-seeking leaders entirely to pursue their narrow individual or clannish interests. Leaders at various levels were tied through patron-client relationships. The Marxist school sought to analyze the class character of the nationalist movement and tried to explain it in terms of economic developments of the colonial period. They showed how the rise of industrial capitalism and market society in India gave birth to a proletariat class who was exploited both by the Indian elite and the British imperial rulers. The early Marxist scholars were R.P. Dutt and the Soviet historian V.I. Pavlov. Their theories were later refined by S.N. Mukherjee, Bipin Chandra and Sumit Sarkar. Mukherjee pointed out the complexities of nationalism, its multiple layers and meanings, the importance of caste along with class and the simultaneous use of a traditional as well as a modern language of politics. Sarkar pointed out the non-bourgeois background of the Indian educated feelings conceptations ES classes and argued that they acted as traditional intellectuals, unconnected with the processes of production, responding to world ideological currents like liberalism or nationalism. 5.6. 2. Cultural nationalism. The new bunch of ideas in the field of nationalist studies that emerged in the 1980s came to be known as the cultural TUM. Historians now were more focused on the socio-cultural aspects behind the formation of nationalist feelings. The Subal-T Studies School provided space for these arguments. Ranajit Guha, in the beginning of the first volume, summarized the staunch critique they launched against the previous schools of thought. The historiography of Indian nationalism has for a long time been dominated by elitism. They were in essence the radical Manist school and derived their theoretical inputs from the writings of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. The proponent of the idea of hegemony or cultural dominantpathy thought that organized national movement which ultimately led to the formation of the Indian nation-state was hollow nationalism of the elites, while real nationalism was that of the masses, whom it called the subaltern. They stressed on the cultural difference between the elite and the masses. The bourgeois leadership, Guha argued in a later essay, failed to establish its hegemony through either persuasion or coercion, as it was continually contested by the peasantry and the working class, who had different idioms of mobilization and action, which the nationalist movement failed to appropriate. The nationalist leaders extended dominance over the masses but could never hegemonize them. So, according to Guha, the Indian national movement was a history of dominance without hegemony. This apparently political theory has gone through change in the last 2 decades. Its focus shifted from class to community, from material analysis to the privileging of culture, mind and identity. Sumit Sarkar defined this change as the decline of the subaltern in subaltern studies. Dipesh Chakraborty and Partha Chatterjee argued that elite dominant groups too could have a subaltern past. Following Edward Said, the author of the famous book Orientalism, they argued that the elite bourgeois class was hegemonized by the British rule and their minds were colonized by the British. And in this sense, they can be seen as subaltern in comparison to the ruling class. In his famous work The Nation and Its Fragments, Partha Chatterjee argued that the educated intelligentsia fragmented their world into 2 spheres, the inner and the outer. To put it in more formal language, TIE. These were the private and the public. The bourgeoisie resisted the entry of the British in the private sphere. They maintained and developed their own version of modernity and nationalism in their inner sphere, while in public sphere they interacted with the British and heavily borrowed from their culture. The subaltern school pioneered a series of research on the idea of cultural nationalism. The studies under this banner came to be known as post-colonial theory and got merged with a wider global theory. By the 1950s, all major colonies momentum worldwide. Scholars were in search of a common theory of nationalism of the world gained independence. Comparative studies of the colonies got and colonialism. Cultural studies emerged as an area which appealed to post-colonial scholars everywhere. Jayan Prakash published his book Another Reason 1999. He partially revised the theory of Chatterjee. Prakash argued that there a fundamental opposition between the inner sphere of the nation and its cue to life as a nation-state. The latter was the former's existence at another, abstract level. The nation-state was imagined not fully on Western model. It was rather a criticism of Western modernity from the vantage point of India's spiritual cultural heritage. Jawaharlal Nehru too rejected the argument that Indian nationalism was a Western import. Outside these dominant historiographical schools, there are some important works that contributed to the understanding of Indian nationalism. Currently, historians are more interested in studying the forms of anti-colonial resistance. They are using vernacular sources and trying to read the voice of different groups. Amy Alumba, Indian literary scholar, observed that the nation itself is a ground of dispute and debate, aside for the competing imaginings of different ideological and political interests. India was a plural society and therefore, Indian nationalism was bound to have many voices, as different classes, groups, communities and regions interpreted their nation in various, sometimes even contradictory, ways. India was the battleground for identities, like class identity, caste identity, religious identity and so on. The colonial state applied divide and rule policy to inspire rivalries between various groups. They were determined to break the forged unity of the Indian nation. On the other hand, the Indian nationalists tried to fight these fissures and publicize an alternative discourse of integration. Leaders of Jawaharlal Nehru talked about the old Indian ideal of harmony and synthesis, and expected an ideal application of these elements to forge a common nationality. Thus, we can see that the basis of cultural nationalism was emotional unity. We have discussed the various aspects of political and cultural nationalism. In conclusion, we can borrow from Homi Bhabha to argue that nation building is a never-ending process. There is no utopian time when everyone would be happy and fulfilled. Nation building is a process of continuous adjustment, accommodation and contestation. The deprived sections of society would constantly fight for their social rights. People belonging to different communities would keep on creating their own spaces within the nation. The demands for equality and liberty would go on. There is no unilinear way to progress. Progress is a relative idea. Its connotation varies from one community to another, one region to the next. The job of a historian is to examine the nuances of these various meanings and to depict the picture of the multiple faces of a nation. Was no differenti of Neue Czech your progress 10. What was the Neo-Traditionalist Group 11? When was the All India Trade Union Congress, AITA, established? 5.7 Summary. The term colonialism has different connotations. Over the passage of time its meaning evolved. To put it in a simple way, the earliest perception of colonialism involved economic backwardness. It implied that the British were exploiting India economically. The economic critique of the British began systematically in the late 19th century with the foundation of the Congress. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 with the inspiration of the British civil servant Charles Octavian Hume and provided a space for discussion to the English educated classes of India. The early Congress leaders were known as the moderates as they did not prefer to enter into direct conflict with the British. They took the path of negotiations and compromises. Often criticized by their successors, for Chandra, colonialism was basically economic exploitation or the appropriation of the colony's social surplus. Forms of surplus appropriation or the manner in which the colonial economy and society was to be subordinated and put at the service of the metropolis underwent changes over time. During the first stage, the basic objectives of colonialism were 1. Monopoly of trade with the colony vis-a-vis other European merchants and the colony's traders and producers. 2. The direct appropriation of revenue or surplus through state power. With the fast-changing world economy after 1914, a new stage of colonialism could be noticed. Spread of industrialization to several countries of Europe, North America and Japan. The massive application of scientific knowledge to industry and unification of the world market due to a revolution in the means of international transport triggered the development of this third stage. Since the 1970s, new ideas began to appear about colonialism that made us look beyond the aspects of economic exploitation, borrowing the term hegemony from Antonio Gramsci. Historians examined the violence colonialism exerted on the minds of the colonized by changing their social system, kinship relations, linguistic orientations, food habits and cultural norms. Homi Bhabha, the famous philosopher, had his own theory on colonialism. He opined that the central feature of his theory was that the colonized tried to mimic the colonist. But they never fully succeeded in doing it, as the Marxist school of historians stressed the economic aspects of colonialism. The group known as the Cambridge School focused on local politics and interests of individuals. They saw colonialism from the viewpoint of selfish interests of the leaders. The group of historians known as the Sabalta School, who appeared in the early 1980s, viewed colonialism from the aspect of marginality. They attracted attention by stating that the history of India so far had been written from the viewpoint of the elites, till the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. India served as a major market for British industries, like cotton, iron and steel, railways, machinery and other items, at the time of the First World War. Indians consumed 85% of cotton piece goods produced at Lancashire and 17% of British iron and steel production was absorbed by the Indian railways. The suffering caused by the decline of handicrafts was counterbalanced fairly soon by the much greater employment and income-generating effect of setting up factories and industries. The US scholar Morris D. Morris argued that deindustrialization itself was a myth. Tirthankar Roy too is a champion of this thesis. The introduction of railways marked a new era in the history of colonial economy in India. Along with railways, the massive expansion in road transport, irrigation, sanitary system and various other infrastructural facilities most brought a revolution in the socio-economic, even cultural life of India. The railways, though it linked various parts of India and facilitated the nationalist leaders to connect with each other, ultimately appeared to be echoes for the poor Indians. The elevation of railway lines caused repeated floods. The environmental balance was challenged by the forceful expansion of railways through marshy, swampy and riverine landscape of eastern India. It can be argued that between 1900 and 1939, the area under irrigation almost doubled, but by that time India suffered from severe famines, floods and series of epidemics. Commercialization of agriculture added to this exploitation. Between 1942 and 1945, we can see these big businessmen were taking over some of the European companies. By the 1950s, argues Omkar Goswami, they were poised to take over almost all the older industries in the region which had hitherto been dominated by European capital. Differ air interpretation colonization notes, the question of modernity is one of the central themes in the studies on colonialism. Scholars have debated a lot on the definition and nature of. The British utilitarians and evangelicals in the late 18th and catchy 19th century set some standards for modernity. They unanimously held that India was backward and it was the duty of the colonial master to civilize the Indians. The historians of the Indian awakening or renaissance of the 19th century presented various arguments on the arrival of modernity in India to the 1940s and 1950s. The general notion was that the cultural awakening liberated India from the Dark Age and medieval orthodoxies. The subaltern studies collectively enriched this criticism. Ranajit Guha, Pedra Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakraborty and Sudipto Kaviraj chronicled the Philly of the Renaissance. The nationalist movement combined the cultural ideas of modernity with the ongoing political struggle. The nationalist leaders understood that attaining nationhood and self-governance was the only way to be modern. The nationalist movement combined the cultural ideas of modernity with the ongoing political struggle. The nationalist leaders understood that attaining nationhood and self-governance was the only way to be modern. Gandhi's harsh critique of modernity impressed people all over the world. Leaders fighting racism like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela acknowledged his ideas. Ashis Nandi once called him the first postmodernist critique of modernity. Peasant protests against excessive amount of taxation and various extreme positions of the colonial rule were common since the beginning of the British era, but the most intense peasant movements can be traced back to the 1850s in various parts of India, such as at the eve of the revolt of 1857 feet, the Mapular outbreak in the Malabar, a century-long protest from 18,361,921. The Ramosi peasant revolt in Maharashtra led by Vasudev Balatvadar in 1879. The Kukar revolt in the Punjab led by Baba Ram Singh. Modernity and economic, social and cultural spheres umbrella. The Modi of the 19th Sinu. The idea of national history everywhere various ways. They variously defined on. R.C. Majumdar. Jad formed the theory subsequently Chalam questioned the central Agamis Indian nation began there was no existence of the architects of making. The group of history has been called by R. Indian history within British imperialism of India, the Marxist school movement and tried colonial period. They society in India Gavet Indian elite and the new Bunchevide 1980s came to be and focused on the Soci feelings, the subaltern show nationalism, the stud umbrella. The modern working class emerged in India only in the latter half of the 19th century with the mass expansion of the industrial projects. The idea of nationalism is one of the most discussed and debuted topics in history everywhere around the world. The idea has been categorized in various ways. The term nationalism comes from nation. A term most. R.C. Majumdar, Jagannath Sarkar, A.R. Desai followed by Bipin Chandra formed the theories of political nationalism over decades. They were subsequently challenged by Marxist and Cambridge School scholars who questioned the very basis of the nationalist ideal. The central argument of the nationalist leaders of colonial India was that the Indian nation began to be formed in the late 19th century. Prior to that there was no existence of the political nation. Surendranath Banerjee, only of the architects of the modern Indian nation, titled his memoir A Nation in. The group of historians that was known earlier as the Cambridge School has been called by Rajat Ray the neo-traditionalist group. They studied Indian history within the confines of locality and province. They argued that British imperialism was not strong enough to penetrate into the remote parts variously defined under varying contexts. Making of India, the Marxist school sought to analyze the class character of the nationalist movement and tried to explain it in terms of economic developments of their colonial period. They showed how the rise of industrial capitalism and market society in India gave birth to a proletariat class who was exploited both by the Indian elite and the British imperial rulers. The new bunch of ideas in the field of nationalist studies that emerged in the 1980s came to be known as the cultural turf. Historians now were more focused on the socio-cultural aspects behind the formation of nationalist furlings. The Sabalta School pioneered a series of research on the idea of cultural nationalism. The studies under this banner came to be known as post-colonial theory and got merged with a wider global theory. 58 key terms. Periodization. It refers to the process of dividing history into periods. Combination. It connotes a common feeling of a group of people that they share an identical past. Colonialism. It is the practice of establishing territorial dominion over our colony by an outside political power. 9 answers to check your progress. 1. The moderate leaders of the Indian National Congress included Gopal K. R. Aishna Gokhale, Surendranath Banerjee, Badiruddin Tyabji and P. Hero Shah Mehta. 2. The 3 distinct stages of colonialism are the following. Either first stage, the period of monopoly trade or revenue appropriation. Either second stage, exploitation through gauge trade. The third stage, the era of foreign investments and international competition for colonies. 3. The introduction of railways marked a new era in the history of colonial economy in India. Along with railways, the massive expansion in road transport, irrigation, sanitary system and various other infrastructural facilities. The most broader revolution in the socio-economic, even cultural life of India. 4. The Indigo Rebellion took place in Bengal in 1859 to 1860 and was a revolt by farmers against British planters who had forced them to grow indigo under terms that were greatly unfavorable to the farmers. 5. The European Orientalist scholars had a totally different vision of India. Max Muller, William Jones and William Carey classified the ancient civilization of India as a classical one. Upholding ancient India and Hinduism as an ideal age, they opined that the British advent revived India from her intervening era of darkness. The Orientalist scholars praised the British rule for bringing socio-cultural changes in India that helped the country in stepping forward towards a modern era. 6. Sri Niketan Cooperative was established by Tagore in 1925 with the objectivity of promoting art and craft at the village level. 7. The first most militant and widespread peasant movement during the colonial period was the Indigo Revolt of 1859 to 1860. 8. A major agrarian outbreak occurred in the Pune and Ahmednagar districts of Maharashtra in 1875, which is commonly known as the famous Deccan Riot. Here the targets of the peasants were the Monilanders, who mostly hailed from the Marwari and Gujarati communities. 9. The Mapular outbreak in the Malabar, a century-long protest from 18,361,921. The Ramosi peasant revolt in Maharashtra led by Vasudev Balwant Phadke in 1879. The Kukar revolt in the Punjab led by Baba Ram Singh in 1872 and the series of peasant riots in Assam during 1893 to 1894 are some instances of peasant uprisings that took place in the 19th century. 0. The group of historians that was known earlier as the Cambridge School has been called by Rajat Ray the new traditionalist group. They studied Indian history within the confines of locality and province. They argued that British imperialism was not strong enough to penetrate into the remote parts of India. 1. The All India Trade Union Congress, ATA, was established in 1920. 10 questions and exercises. Or answer questions. 1. Write a short note on Bipin Chandra's interpretation of the concept of colonialism. 2. Briefly mention the various perspectives on social and cultural colonialism. 3. How did commercialization of agriculture add to the exploitation of Indians by the British? 4. How did the peasant movement's contribution in the development of the nationalist movement in India? 5. How did the workers' movement contribute to the Indian freedom struggle? 6. Define the term nationalism in your own words and answer questions. 1. Examine diverse views on the nature of colonial economy. 2. How did the process of modernization adopted by the British prove detrimental for the Indians? 3. Discuss the arguments put forward by the Marxist and subaltern scholars in favor of modernity in India. 4. The nationalist movement combined the cultural ideas of modernity with the ongoing political struggle. Explain the statement. 5. The subaltern school pioneered a series of research on the idea of cultural nationalism. Examine the statement. 6. Do you agree with the central argument that Indian nation began to be formed in the late 19th century? Give reasons for your answer.